In section 11.3, the latter half of this chapter, they ask where we got gender from. This is a good time to review what is the difference between sex and gender. So, biological sex are the hormones, physiological, chromosomal, all the things that are different between two sexually reproducing or potentially sexually reproducing members of a species, males and females. Gender refers to social ideas that we have about people who have certain anatomies or certain stuff going on with them. Sometimes we try to put those social ideas onto people that we don't even know what they are, like bouncing babies up and down depending on whether we think they're a boy or a girl. Now, among the primates, there are pattern differences by biological sex. They seem to do different things, have different mating patterns, go to different groups. There are patterns of differences that we can observe by biological sex, but we don't see any evidence of among other non-human primates is that they have been socialized differently, taught differently, or handled differently by their parents. It seems like, as we look around the world, that humans are unique in organizing societies around gender. So that is to say that we see biological differences, sex, among other non-human primates and among other creatures, obviously. But in terms of setting up different social arrangements, making people live and work in different social spaces, dress differently, it seems like humans are the only ones, which leads to the question, where did we start or when did this begin among the human or hominin lineage? If it's not with the chimpanzees or bonobos or gorillas, where does it start? So they talk about gender in early hominins, and we have some decent evidence here from the Neanderthals. So this is going back into the, let's just say, 100,000 year ago range, where we see evidence of not just different sex characteristics, but different tasks that were assigned to people during their lifetime. Interestingly, it's not hunting. The degree of physical trauma on both male and female skeletons of Neanderthals suggests that they were both involved in hunting activities. What seems to be different is the type of work, and we know this from the way the tooth wear patterns. It seems like the female Neanderthals might have been assigned to tasks like hides and stripping hides and dealing with animal stuff. It seems like among the Neanderthals, there were different types of work assigned to different sexes, suggesting that there were social differences or ideas about gender being at play. They suggest an interesting hypothesis for why these early hominins started to divide their skills between hunters being generally male and women and childcare being generally female. Now, usually what people have done is look for the biological advantages that men might have had in order to hunt. But it seems like both men and women were involved in hunts. It is also true that many hunting activities are not necessarily as dangerous on an everyday level as they are often portrayed. So a lot of hunting that goes on is through net hunting and snares, traps, things like that. So this is an interesting hypothesis that it wasn't necessarily that the men were better hunters, but the women were better at childcare. Their advantage on that, then they were the ones taking care of the children. They sent the men off to do their hunting and fishing thing because the women were better at childcare. It's an interesting idea. It's just as interesting as the male hunting hypothesis, which we might talk about here. So the other side of this is we do know that Humans were doing hunting in part because it provided calorically dense foods. There's a survival advantage hypothesis, which would suggest that there's a division of labor based on the fact that you need to feed these hungry, large-brained children. You'd send the men off to hunt because they were better at that, and that provided more stuff for the kids. Interestingly, though, we find a decent number of female skeletons with hunting toolkits for big game. There was recently a find that your textbook describes in Peru. So again, it does not necessarily seem that hunting was limited to males, but certainly different ideas about who should be doing what are starting to emerge among our human closely related ancestors, such as the Neanderthals and other early humans. Whenever we are looking at this fossilized evidence and stuff from bones, we always have to be careful because we make a lot of assumptions based on things that have happened in our own society. So our textbook talks about the example of a Viking warrior that was found. And again, it's just always assumed that these people are guys. But the point of the matter is that oftentimes when we dig up skeletons, we assume they belong to one gender or another based on our own assumptions. It's important to figure out what might have been going on in the past, hopefully through DNA analysis, which is revealing things about skeletons that we often did not know. Some of the assumptions that were made about skeletons that have been dug up, which has since been disproven. The next part talks about relationships among genders and a form of political power and social power that we know of as patriarchy. Patriarchy is a form in which men have dominant authority. They occupy most of the political positions, have most of the resources, and probably have much control over home life as well. Patriarchy is something that occurs in many different societies around the world. It is fairly prevalent, we might say. It is especially prevalent or powerful if a society is patrilineal and patrilocal. A patrilineal society is one in which inheritance and other things are passed down through the male line. A patrilocal society is one in which the women, when they get married, would leave their own homes and go to their husbands' homes. So if you think about both those things together, it would lead to a situation in which the men are holding most of the power because the women are leaving their own homes, going to live with people they do not necessarily know, and are producing or are part of a system in which their reproductive capacities are so that male heirs can be produced in this society. And these systems were often introduced or reinforced during the colonial expansion of European powers. There are many indigenous societies in which they did not necessarily have a patriarchal idea of the world, or if they did, it might not have been very strong. But during the colonial period, we see different ideas imposed upon and regulated in other societies. Among the Maori, for example, they give you this example of a male and female deity. And the Maori had the idea that these were complementary, that both male and female deities had a interlaced power. Again, under colonialism, these ideas were in many ways suppressed or tried to be modified by missionaries and other people who wanted to introduce more patriarchal norms. Your textbook mentions, and it's important to realize, that patriarchy doesn't always benefit all men equally. It's often beneficial to the top men in a society, but it can raise some very difficult norms for people to live up to. So it mentions that during some of the economic crises, and certainly during our own time, that it's sometimes very difficult for working class men to support families at the level at which society says they should be able to. You sometimes see differential rates of bad health and bad practices, you might say, among certain classes of men because they aren't really getting the benefits of patriarchy that are flowing to the higher levels or higher classes of society. So, this is one form that we see a lot in various parts of the world in terms of male dominance. Matriarchies are relatively rare. So, oftentimes people are looking for something that might be a parallel to a patriarchal dominance. We don't see societies in which women hold all of the power, but there are societies in which women hold a lot of the political power, or at least there is political close to equality. Your textbook gives you the example of the Minangkabau in West Sumatra, which is said to be the world's largest matriarchy. There are still men who in this society have elected political positions, but much of the authority is exercised by women, or there's relative equality between them. This was probably true of many of the Native American or indigenous societies in the Americas. A lot of these societies were and are matrilineal. So instead of being patrilineal, things and inheritance are handed down through mothers and through women. And in some cases, it would be the men who would leave their groups and join with their wives. Now, again, this didn't mean that the women held all the political power in these societies, but you could see that if the inheritance is being handed down through the matriline, and people are moving from their homes, the men are moving from their homes to join with their wives. Being married to a man was not necessarily the most important relationship that a person would have in this society. Their relationship to their mother or their mother's brother is perhaps more important. There are also examples, and perhaps many of these societies should be better termed as a diarchy, in which political and economic power is divided. There's not one gender who is holding most of the political or economic power. In today's world, as we look out across the world, there is a lot of gender inequality. There are not very many places or countries that we can say that have achieved equity in terms of gender. This is manifested in gender-based disparities or differences that lead to inequalities. So if we look at various places, and this is not the same in every place, but we see a lot of differences in how much access to health care women and girls have, how much access to education girls might have growing up, what the employment opportunities are for women, if there is a wage gap between women and men. It is very persistent in many societies, including our own. Reproductive rights, whether women have access to and control over their own bodily reproduction, is often something that is fought out politically and has its ups and downs, as we might know from our own country. The recognition of lots of different ways in which people are gender different, sexuality different, and often are sometimes linked to biological differences. Are those recognized? Are people respected as human beings? This is something that is politically fought out and has varying levels of acceptance or recognition in different societies. There are also differential rates of gender-based violence. For the most part, statistically, this is something that happens to sadly, girls and women at a much higher rate than it would happen for boys and men. So gender-based violence is another way in which these things are not equitably distributed, and we have a lot of work to do to understand and change those things. Gender roles do not come from our primate heritage. That is to say, way back in evolution in terms of chimpanzees. We see sex differences, to be sure, but we do not see gender roles emerging from the non-human primates. They develop, or we see evidence for them maybe 100,000 years ago or so. They are in our evolutionary heritage, and they are in hunting and gathering. However, very importantly, gender inequalities and restrictive gender roles begin to emerge and are usually more pronounced with agriculture and then in industrial societies. So among hunting and gathering groups, in today's world and in past hunting and gathering groups, there might have been gender differences, and in some of them there were gender inequalities. But as we've seen, they usually weren't very pronounced and they weren't very restrictive. We only see patriarchies, these political systems in which men start to dominate and take control over wealth and resources, come out with agriculture. So these are not super old ideas around 12,000 years ago. Other ideas like property and warfare start to emerge around the same time. About 500 years ago, we have European colonialism start to really rev up. And in some ways, this definitely intensifies previous patriarchal ideas or imposes them upon people who might not have been thinking in that way. And it's really only in the last 200 or 300 years that we have bureaucratic state regulation of some of these identities. So the idea that you have to check off a box on a form, or that you are regulated in your movement and how much education you can have, was not necessarily a feature of a society in which there isn't a school system or formal training. So the idea that these are bureaucratically regulated and that you might have differential access to healthcare education is something that only comes out fairly recently in human societies. Much of the work that would need to be done is in some ways to recapture some of the fluidity and less restrictive nature of societies, which were more prevalent in our past than in our present. At the end of this chapter, your textbook reintroduces a term that I said, I don't know if it would catch on. They ask, what is next for gender star asterisk sex? The social ideas about who should have how much food and who should have how much exercise and what sports people should play and what jobs they should do influences our developing biology and make us look like different persons. Who should have to put on makeup and who should be prohibited from putting on makeup. Your textbook says that gender sex is in flux globally, with women gaining more rights and innovations allowing physical transitions. We also talked about how ideas of alternative gender arrangements are in many societies ancient and have been practiced long before Western societies or our own societies got those ideas. Your textbook also says that modern communications, media, social platforms provide avenues to question and redefine gender. But this is a pretty open question, because is it true that women are gaining more rights and innovations that allow physical transitions? Not sure that's really going the way our textbook authors might have predicted when this book was written a couple years ago. In many states, in many US states today, I would not be able to teach the material in this chapter of the textbook. They throw me out. be illegal to talk about these things.